Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's genealogy program. The topic today is genealogy assets of the museum. And so Terry's been busy doing some research and learning about what's at the museum. So we hope that you come down and see us at 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard. And I've got a few announcements. I'll save those for the end. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Terry.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about all of the wonderful assets that are available here at our local museum. We're going to skip this in the future because we realize that if you have trouble viewing, you probably are not seeing this slide. So we'll jump right in. This is a partial listing. I have some on the following page as well of some of the things that are in the museum here. And while many of us do not have ancestry in Canyon City, if you're fortunate enough to have ancestors in Canyon City, you have a gold mine of resources here. But for those of us that don't, make sure that you contact, or if at all possible, visit the areas where your ancestors lived, because many of these things that we're going to be talking about today are also available in those communities, whether they are with local historical societies, genealogical societies, libraries, museums, or even state archives. These are not unique by any stretch of the imagination, but they are housed in different areas and different localities. And we have the wonderful opportunity to have these all under one roof here. So we're going to talk about each one of these topics and areas, and the various types of records that might be found in those, and what genealogical tips and secrets they might reveal. The first and easiest area to talk about is books. The museum here has a collection of books that span the history of Colorado, as well as some of the unique assets that are here in the Canyon City community. So we'll take a look here, first of all, at a history of the state of Colorado. And if you open these volumes, you might find one of your ancestors. Were they among the first settlers in a community? Were they prominent citizens in that community? You might even be able to find a picture of the person in addition to their biography and a listing of their contributions. So there are a wide range of historical volumes that do give these portraits of individuals. So if you don't find them in one, if there are more than one series, then try and look in those as well to find your ancestors. In many cases, a small community will issue on their 100th anniversary or their 150th anniversary a volume of historical value and talk about the individuals that settled in that area. So perhaps you will find information there. There are other books about the local area, coming down from the state level into the particular county or local area. And in some cases, each community has some unique aspect. Here we have a deep and broad history. We're known today for the prisons, but there were also many farms, gardening opportunities, and canning and preserving, as well as mining activities. So there are specific volumes that might be dedicated to those areas as well. So if you had an ancestor that had a unique occupation, you might want to check these volumes. If they are not listed in the specific volume, you may find out circular information. You might find out about when the mine operated, what they were actually mining, the various occupations within a mine, for an example. Here's a listing from inside of one of the books that is a commercial canning and preserving operations. And it's simply a listing of those operations that existed here through many of the years. So if you find that your ancestor in one of the censuses was working in a cannery, you might want to check these volumes to see perhaps which one he might have been working in. Add meat to the bones on your ancestor's story. I can't talk enough about how valuable city, business, and telephone directories are, especially the city and business directories. One of the big things is that it records a person's address between the census years. And for the years between 1880 and 1900, it is absolutely critical. The 1890 census was burned, so you have a 20-year span, and these city and business directories will help you to bridge that gap. Who are all the people that are living at the same address? You might find that extended families live together in a single household. Or you might find a relative, a sister-in-law or a brother-in-law that is living with the family. These directories will identify the actual business name where the person worked. And they may also give you an indication when a person died. I have seen several city directories that have listed people by their name, and they will actually give a death date. If they died prior to the issuing of death certificates in about the 1920s or so, this could be valuable information for you. I have also seen in the case of some single women where they married and relocated, and that information is called out in a city directory as well. Frequently, small towns will renumber their streets or even rename their streets. And either in the front or the back of the city directory, it will give that information to you, what the old name was and what the new name was. Here is an 1896 business directory that is housed at the museum, and you'll notice a series of businesses. If it's a city business, for example, it will say who is actually the proprietor of that business. So if it's a general name as opposed to a specific name, then you get the information about what your ancestor might have been contributing to that business. This directory is much later, but it is a reverse directory. And it lists, for example, a street. In this particular case, we've highlighted Grand Avenue, and in numerical order. As of 1957, it lists all the people that are living at the various addresses on Grand. While many of us know this information. At some point, we don't have the 1950 census released yet. So if one of your relatives, especially if you're looking for descendants, if one of them has moved in the intervening years, this information might provide that clue that you need as to where they were and where they were headed. Then there are the listings by individual name, usually in alphabetical order, and it will give the person's name, and in this case, the wife's name as well, Charles and Gwendolyn, where his business address is, as well as where his residential address is. And we notice that FH and his wife Hester are living at the same address, as well as, so is that a brother? Is that a father-son? And we see also Harold, Margaret, and Mildred. And Harold is a student at the University of Colorado, while the younger girls are probably students at Canyon City High School. So check these city directories. And because they're issued every year, you can go year by year and track each one of these people. City directories also usually at the back have an index of businesses, societies, churches, schools, and who might be working at those. So if you know that your person was a barber, for example, by trade, you might be able to find his information and the name of the shop that he was working at in the city directory. While many of us now turn to find a grave or ancestry to actually locate our ancestors in their burial places and to hopefully get pictures of their tombstones, there are inventories as well. The Daughters of the American Revolution, in one of their first projects when they organized in 1890, was to do inventories of cemeteries. Some of these cemeteries have gone by the wayside and are abandoned. Some of those cemeteries were on private land, which is harder to access nowadays. If your ancestor did not have a tombstone, in many cases, they might not be picked up in a find a grave situation, but they may be accounted for in a cemetery inventory. So don't overlook these as well. Because we have prisons here, there is a unique volume of Colorado State Penitentiary Death Book, and it covers approximately 100 years. It's not quite as straightforward as we think because it doesn't give the names of the prisoners, but instead gives their numbers. So further research would need to be done to correlate the number. In this case, the deaths all occurred in 1900. So they probably predate death certificates. So this information could be extremely important. For this particular entry, number 4660, we find some additional information that this person was a head nurse in the hospital and took his own life. There are also potentially church records of burials. This one happens to be from St. Benedict's Catholic Church, and it's arranged in alphabetical order. So all of these people are Kazakhs, and they died in various years, and it tells which cemeteries they were buried in as well, and it has both the death and the burial date. So some critical information. Here again, preceding death certificates. Yearbooks. Yearbooks are becoming more popular on Ancestry, but check the local library or here in the museum and you'll see various yearbooks, not only from the high school, but also from middle schools. This one is from 1953, and we see photographs, and it gives the person's name, a quote about the person, and lists the various activities that they participated in during their high school years. There are also some really, really old ones that just have beautiful, beautiful pictures along with the sayings about the person. Many, many libraries have what are called vertical files or family files, and these can be invaluable. One of the things that I would recommend is if you have done your genealogy and you have information about your ancestors, provide that information to the local library or historical society in the community where your ancestor lived. There are those of us that go looking for this information, and we're looking for any treasures that might be found in these family files. You might find a family group sheet. And while we've been working on our own genealogy and have perhaps created family group sheets, there may be a case where you double check the information and find, oh, there might have been a child that was born and died, say in that 1880 to 1900 timeframe, and we might have missed that child. So always check the family group sheets that might be available in those family files and cross-reference them. You may have more information than is available in that file. And that's when making a contribution to that particular library or museum would be extremely helpful to the person doing their research. Always include your name and contact information if you do submit anything so that you can start a dialogue with others. There might be newspaper articles honoring certain accomplishments of an ancestor. There might even be a newspaper article that reports a family reunion, who the original family was and when they settled in the particular area, and who all the descendants are that are attending this family reunion. It's a great way to add to your family picture. There are also obituaries. If the newspaper has degraded or been lost, or the microfilm roll is hard to read, sometimes there are transcripts of the obituaries. We see that this person died in 1926 in Pueblo, and we have her brief life story. There was an obituary published in the paper. And sometimes they're not always picked up by the local paper. If someone died out of state, it might not have been recorded in the local. So something like this would be very, very valuable in a family file. And then there are these gold mines, a firsthand account of someone's life, perhaps a multiple page biography of an ancestor, either a grandparent or a great grandparent. One of the critical things on all of these is to identify yourself when writing this. And you're talking about I'm the granddaughter of mom, and you want to know, well, what was her name? So make sure that you include all of the names and the relationships so that if people want to contact you, they understand what is your relationship to potentially their ancestor. There might also be letters. If someone originally was born in the same hometown, but they moved away at some point in time. Here's a gentleman that graduated in 1942 and the family moved to California. So if you are looking for the current descendants of the family, something like this with a name and an address might be key and critical information that you need to complete your genealogical study. It also gives you the opportunity to contact the person and establish communication and start to share information. Also contained in these vertical files might be address files. Do you live in an old home that has been passed down through multiple generations? And are you interested in the history of your house? Are you interested in finding the history of your ancestors' house? If you come from the New England area, there are still houses that were built in the 1700s. What is the history of that house? When did your people move into that house? Were they the first owners of that house and they have passed through the generations? So much information might be available. You might find actual photographs. While this is not a single family dwelling, we have a current picture and a previous picture, what it looked like beforehand. And I was talking about the history of the house. This is extracted information that has been worked on from various sorts, but we see the history of the building that we just saw, where it was constructed. It was originally a wooden Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and then the YMCA used it. It was used as a hospital and is currently a dwelling now, a multifamily dwelling. So you look at the history of something. Was your family were they members of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church? It would be interesting to see the evolution of this structure. Address files may also contain plat maps. These are maps that are drawn up not necessarily every year, but every few years, and they record all of the names of the people that are living on the various parcels of land. So you can actually locate your ancestors' house or the property. From personal experience, I can say that there's nothing more moving than walking on your ancestors' land. Just like we saw earlier with the larger building, there are individual addresses and the history of the families that lived at those addresses, arranged chronologically by year, and then who all was living there. How long were the people living there? Did somebody inherit something from a previous generation and then maintain the property? You might also see that you have William E. McCartney, and then all of a sudden we just have Lucy, Mrs. Lucy. So perhaps William died in that intervening period. Clues for you to pursue. And sometimes you'll find an oral history. This one happens to be an oral history, a transcript of an oral history of the property, not of the people. And it is included in an address file. So who were the owners? Some of the previous owners of that property. What did they do to improve the property that might have changed from when your ancestor lived there or to what your ancestor moved into? So check these out. And then sometimes there's a real estate listing that you might be able to find to see an actual description of the house, especially if the house no longer is there. And you can also look at the value of the house in previous times. It's really interesting to see how inflation throughout the years has changed those properties and the values. There are also subject files, all kinds of topics from A to Z. This one happens to be a drawer that talks about many of the churches in the local community. But there are arts, there are schools, there are various kinds of businesses. What were all the brick companies that might have been here in Canyon City? What are some of the other industries? Was there an ice house in your particular locality? What is something that it was unique in your ancestors' hometown that might be covered in a subject file? This sheet represents a cross-reference in the file, and it lists out where other assets concerning the same thing might be found, the years that those assets talk about. Sometimes you might find photographs, sometimes you might find histories in books or other materials. So look at the cross-reference sheet as well. I happen to choose churches, and this particular file had a history of the abbey that was written actually by one of the priests. So a snapshot in time, but it gives you an actual overview of the history for this particular institution. In one of these files, don't overlook them, I happened to find in Cohoes, New York, a photograph of the high school that my grandmother attended, and she graduated in 1896. The building no longer exists, so that picture was invaluable. Are there pictures of bygone eras, the interior of things that have gone away, that have been changed or remodeled as the decades have passed? Are there newspaper articles about that particular institution? Are there gifts that have been made to it? Did something happen to the building? Was it renovated? Was a certain amount of money infused into the amelioration of the building? Did somebody pay for improvements? This is something that I personally have not investigated in the past, but we do have these records here in the museum. If your person died as a result of an accident in some way, shape, or form, whether it was truly an accident or a murder, or whether they just died of unknown causes, there's probably going to be a coroner's report. What is interesting in some of these is, in many cases, an inquest was required and a jury was chosen, and all of this information is recorded. Here is the cover sheet of one of these cases where the information for who are the various attorneys. Was your person an attorney? Was your person the county coroner? Who were the victims, or who are the people that have passed away that are causing this inquest to take place? There is an actual court transcript attached to these files. We have both the questions and the answers. We know who is doing the testimony. We know who is asking the questions, and there are going to be multiple pages. This is going to be something that's going to take some real digging. It is probably not something that you are going to find indexed. So if you suspect that your relative died in unusual circumstances, you might want to investigate coroner's records. And we get a final judgment in this particular case. We have a verdict by the jury, and we find that the above named persons, and there were several of them, came to their death from one coal dust fire in coal plant department of the said cement plant, where the above named persons were laboring, said coal dust being ignited by some unknown cause. So, and we have the signatures of the jurors that made this determination. So unfortunately, an accident that took the lives of 7 people. In some cases, title companies have submitted their abstracts of title to the museum, estate archives, etc. And these will give you the entire history of a household. Many of the current records are available at the courthouse, but some of these records are also in museums or archives. And we see in this particular case, we get 20 shares of ditch water, a certificate, and I believe it's from 1948. So a unique situation here in the West, especially in Canyon City. We also get the file. This is the cover sheet for the abstract of title for a particular piece of property. This is simply the cover sheet. And the first page shows that the land was given by patent in 1868 to John Henry Harrison. And through the pages, we see, for example, in 1902, that for the sum of $600, that Henry Harrison is selling it to Lizzie Harrison, perhaps a relative or a daughter. And it's only a portion. It's just the lots 3 and 4, not 1 and 2. And we also later on, I believe this is like the 15th page in there, we have a decree from July of 1927. And John E. Willis is deceased, and his wife is getting her portion of the lots. And while they don't use the term, it is in payment of widow's allowance. So this is probably a dower allowance. She is entitled to a certain portion of the land as a result of her husband's death. We can't say enough about newspapers. We turn to newspapers to find all kinds of information. Whether your person is called out in a newspaper or not, you need to do some research in newspapers for the local area as well as on a nationwide basis. What is happening in the world at the time your ancestors are living in a particular place? What is happening in the local community that they are living in? Is there some dire emergency? Is there an explosion in the town that might have taken out the main source of employment in the area? So what would the effect have been on your ancestor and their livelihood? So it's important to look at newspapers. We have a very, very large inventory on microfilm, as well as paper copies, as well as extracted information in the family files. As I have mentioned, you might see listings of births in local hospitals. We certainly see obituaries, and in the 1950s and 60s, and engagement announcements, wedding announcements along with pictures were also prominent. So not only do you have the vital records, you have all that background information. Was there a certain celebration that might have occurred within the family that might have been recorded in a newspaper article? Older newspapers, you will find that there are listings for someone came to town to visit someone else, and you'll get the names. So who are the acquaintances that your ancestors visited or were visited by? Photographs. The museum here has a huge, I would venture to say, definitely tens of thousands of photographs. The Canyon City Daily Record, the newspaper, has submitted their collection. There are also individuals that have submitted their collections. In some cases, they are pictures of individual people. In other cases, they might be local attractions, businesses, buildings, wonderful things. They are in the form of both print and digital photographs. We also have negatives, glass plates. We don't have double negatives. And photo albums and scrapbooks might have been submitted as well. This is a glass plate of one of the buildings here on Main Street in Canyon City. And did your ancestor work in this building? Did your ancestor happen to own this building? It's the kind of thing that adds that meat to the bones. Here is a compendium sheet with several photographs, some of them sideways, some of them forward, some of them quite old, something like a carte de visite or a family group. Hopefully on the back of this picture, all of these people are identified. As is the case with this next photo, while this is very, very pale and very difficult to read, it identifies the people in the order in which they appear in the photo, those that are in the back row, those that are in the front row. And it also talks about when the photo was actually taken. So if you have some of these photos in your collection and don't have anyone to pass them down to, you might think about the local area where your family was from, providing the information to them. It's a central location for all of those descendants to look. And here is that picture that identifies the 4 in the back and the 2 in the front, who look like twins, actually. Is there a picture of the house that your people lived in from a bygone time? Is that house still in existence, or has it been moved or destroyed for something more modern? So don't overlook the idea of finding pictures of the houses where your ancestors might have lived. And of course, there are those individual portraits that hopefully identify the people and perhaps the occasion under which the photo was taken. Photo albums. People have submitted photo albums. And unfortunately, we do not see the names of the people on this particular page. I apologize for the quality of the photograph, but you get the general idea. So look to see if perhaps someone else from their perspective has submitted an album of family photographs. Scrapbooks. Different organizations or individuals collect information and perhaps make a scrapbook out of it. Did one of your relatives belong to the Navy Mothers Club of America? And shout out to whoever did this, the woman, I believe it was Mrs. Yarberry, but she identified each of the people in the photographs. She included newspaper articles about what the organization was doing. So did one of your ancestors belong to a unique organization that might have had monthly meetings, that might have done something for the community or made contributions to the community that would be interesting for you to discover? I discovered these records in the museum, and in many, many cases, I have not seen too many census records for school censuses. The few that I have seen on the internet are of a completely different form than these are. But these are nice little booklets, and the museum has these all the way through the 1960s. So 100 years, perhaps. And it gives simply the boys from ages 6 to 16. It includes a wide range. That's a 10-year range to be looking at. So Frederick could be anywhere from 6 to 16. The girls could be anywhere from 6 to 16. But we see potentially siblings. This particular one that I chose was from 1879. So these people would appear in the 1880 census. If they don't appear in the 1880 census, you have a grounding that shows that they are here. Perhaps at 16, one of these girls might have gotten married. Perhaps at some in-between age, one of these people might have passed away. So it raises the question that you need to do more research. And we have even older, the 16 to 21. These books were done annually, and I chose a second one from 1887. This is that gap because of the loss of the 1890 census. And while it is arranged in the same way that the previous volume was, we also see that by doing a year-by-year study and analysis, you can derive how old these children are. When did they first appear in this 6 to 16 range? When do they exit that 6 to 16 range and perhaps move on? Did they graduate, or did they complete their education at age 16 and move into business or otherwise? But especially in that 20-year gap, it gives you a lot of potential information to study. While I don't have any photographs that illustrate the oral histories, the museum does have cassette tapes and digital audio files giving oral histories made with interviews and stories from individuals here in the community. There are transcripts of these audio files, and they are filed with the family files. If it happens to be about a house, we saw that they were filed in with the address files. Maps. Maps are a fabulous introduction to your land records and the information that might be contained in those. This happens to be a book from 1917, pretty late, but maps were drawn from day one, talking about who lived in which section of property. This happens to be a small booklet and it is from the 1917, but we see a plat map giving each one of the people that own parcels of land for this particular township and range. We have seen in the address files, we have seen other plat maps. They were done on a regular basis so that you can trace through the years who owns which property and when properties are changing hands. A different section, and we see the names of the subdivisions in the local area. There are also Sanborn insurance maps. While they don't usually identify the people that are living in the individual households, they simply identify them as homes or houses. They do cover the businesses in a particular area. They call out schools and other public buildings as well. So you can get an idea of what the community looked like when your ancestor lived there. Is there a local group? Is there a woman's club? Is there a church group? Is there a club or organization that is unique to your community? Or is there a national organization, for example, Rotary or Lions Club, that has minutes, notes, photographs, meetings, that the information has been turned over to your local genealogical society, museum, or what have you? If you know that your ancestor belonged to one of these organizations, see what you can find in those. What contributions did they make? Did they hold an office in these particular groups? There are also church records. There are records of when people entered the community and joined particular church, when people might have been baptized, if it's a church that does not practice infant baptism, when were people baptized? In this particular case, it's showing where people are coming from or where they are moving to. So you want to look at those records to see, did somebody from your family move across the country and move from one particular area to another, and you've lost them perhaps in the census, but you can find them among church records. While these are Baptist church records, we do have other denominations. And I know, for example, in terms of the moving, if you have Quaker ancestry, when they left one meeting, that information was recorded. When they entered a new meeting, where they moved to, that information is recorded. If you happen to be interested in Swedish genealogy, this is how it too is done, by the leaving and entering of farmlands. Hopefully, all your people stayed on the right side of the law, but just in case they didn't, we also have some police magistrate records. And in this particular case, we have the name, and unfortunately, I'm not able to read it, but we have the name of the arresting officer. And this person is charged with violating Section 4 of a particular ordinance. And he has been found guilty and has been charged with a $3 fine. And there are other court costs. He owes $9.65, which in December he has paid $5 towards that fine. And in the following February, he has paid off the remainder of his fine. So poor Mr. Lee. Oops, excuse me. We also find a more elaborate magistrate record. And this is from 1895, selling liquor on a Sunday. And we have a long description of Robert Brumley, and his attorney is James, and what he has done. A complaint was made, sworn to, and filed this day by John Hutchins. So who's the complainer? Warrant issued and delivered to Joel H. Thomas, City Marshal, and Robert Bunton, arrested and brought into court the same day and pled not guilty. And the defendant gave bond in the sum of $100. In 1895, that's a significant sum. For his appearance in court on the 26th day of March, 1895, at 10 o'clock in the morning, to which day and hour this case was continued. And what happened the next day? Robert appeared. And James McLaurin, the city attorney, appeared. But the prosecution witness, John Hutchins, did not. And the judge continued the case to the next day. But even then, Mr. Hutchins could not be found. And after waiting several hours, the suit was dismissed. So Robert Bunton got off easily, whether guilty or not. Finally, there are files of 3x5 cards that have are some that with census information, state census information. There are some with instruments of record, which deal primarily with land records. And these are essentially indexes that tell you where certain things may be found. Fremont County Poor Farm and Hospital information for a good 75-year period, as well as others. So don't overlook the many assets that might be available to you in your local area. If you have any questions, or at this point, we will take questions. And I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. That was great. So much information there. I'd like to encourage everybody, please come down to the museum. That's what, as far as the research in the History Center piece of what we do at the museum, that's what we're there for. So come on down. And a few things to follow up on there. You started out with mentioning the family files, and they're so interesting. And if you haven't come down and looked up your own family name or anything like that, please do. But it's interesting because sometimes what may seem seemingly insignificant to us or the person collecting it could really mean a lot to somebody else. And so we really encourage you to bring down any information that you may have and to look through there. And I bet, Terri, you can probably agree with this, but I've found doing some genealogy research, sometimes you have to kind of reverse engineer some of that. And so you might have a starting point. Okay, I'm going to look at the great grandfather's name or what have you. But sometimes you can really, if you get creative, you can find different things. And so you may find great grandfather's obituary, and that might mention a living brother. And then you go look up that brother, and that, family file might have just a little bit of information that gives you, kind of get you back to where you started. And so you can really kind of get diverted going down those different family files and different, especially with like obituaries or different events. But it's fun. So carve out some time to come down and look at the files. And then what else? Oh, one other thing, you'd mentioned clubs and organizations, and that made me think at the museum, we have a lot of cookbooks that different churches have put out in different organizations over the
Mhm.
years. uh, with different recipes credited to members of the community. And so those are kind of fun to look at too. And a lot of those cookbooks have little stories as well that people have contributed. So that's kind of a fun thing to look at also. So that being said, just a couple of quick announcements. We are quickly coming up on Canyon City's sesquicentennial jubilee. It's April 2nd. It'll be held at the Canyon City High School. And so it'll be a really fun event celebrating 150 years of Canyon City. The main event will be kind of preceded by what we're calling the City Fair, and that'll be from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And there'll be all sorts of stuff happening. So there'll be vendors and food and live music, skydivers, activities, lots of stuff. So come on down. And then starting at 6:30 at the Canyon City High School football stadium, and there'll be a theatrical representation of our town's history, performances by Encore and the Canyon City High School marching band, and then wrapping it all up with fireworks. So that's April 2nd. Mark your calendars. And you can keep an eye on all of those sesquicentennial events at canyоncity150.org. Anything else?
No, we'll just plug the next genealogy class. We'll be taking a look at photography. We'll do a little bit of history, and we'll also talk about the hints in the pictures that might help you identify the pictures of the people that are in those pictures.
And that's April 16th. And that's the same thing that we have been doing. So you can register on the museum's website, and it'll be a Zoom program just as we've been doing. Thank you, Terry. That was great.
Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And we'll see you hopefully next month.